like a place of peace and rest where you know that you are loved no matter what. A home, I can't say I've ever really known home. I don't know that there is a home when your name is Jacob. Because my life has been a fight. Every day of my life has been a fight. Ever since I was conceived in my mother's womb, I've been fighting with my twin brother Esau. I came out of the womb. I grew up with him fighting with the wishes of my mom, fighting for the love of my dad. I moved from their home to a new home with my uncle, fighting him who's trying to constantly deceive me and cheat me and overwork me. I finally begin to create my own household. I become a husband and a father. And what I find is that it's just like those are just more people to fight with. What I've come to realize is that I've got to fight because nobody is looking out for me but me. And what I've also come to realize is that when you're a fighter, there is no home. Tomorrow, I face the greatest fight of my life. Tomorrow, I'm going to see my brother Esau. And as far as I know, he wants to kill me. But if I'm honest, I'm kind of tired of all the fighting and the lying and the deceiving. I'm worn out of waiting for God. I'm sick of not having a home. And so maybe tomorrow I don't need to win. Maybe to lose tomorrow would finally be some sort of sweet release because all I've ever known of home are nights like tonight when I'm alone under the stars. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those of you watching online and maybe in Westside. My name's Pete, and you're joining us for the last week of this series we've called Jacob, Wrestling with Family, Destiny, and God. And what we're going to do this morning is work our way to this scene that I just gave you a little glimpse of, where Jacob is once again alone at night, and it will become the most important transformational night of his entire life. And what I want us to do is simply to get to that night and then to reflect on what this story has to teach us as we prepare ourselves to take communion together. And if you don't know what communion is, we'll talk about that as we get closer to it. But we're moving towards communion this morning, which is a bit of a reflective space, which is why I brought the stool out. Sometimes I bring it out and I don't even use it. Maybe you've noticed that before. But the stool is there in my mind to help me to slow down, because I tend to want to go fast. I tend to think and look at you, all of you, and I think you're all so bored. You're all on the edge of taking out your phones, and so I try to go really fast. But there's some weeks and there's some moments where I want to go slow so that you can reflect and so that you don't just hear my voice, but so that in the midst of all of this, you actually hear from God. And so we're going to get to some questions that we're going to reflect on. But first, we got to get to this scene where Jacob has the most important night of his life. So if you haven't been with us, a couple things to know about Jacob. Jacob is born as a twin. He's born the second of the two twins, which is kind of funny. But if you're a twin, you know it's important who came out first. He's the second born, and yet God blesses him and says that he'll be the special one. He'll be the one that the promise that it was given to Abraham and to Isaac that it will flow through. And he takes control of this. He's like, okay, I'm going to be the blessed one. And so he steals the birthright and he steals the blessing from his brother. And his brother Esau wants to kill him for this. And so he leaves home for 20 years. And he goes and lives in Haran, where God builds him up into basically a great nation, where he has several wives and he has 11 sons, and he even has a daughter in there that's kind of given as just a throwaway detail. But he's become like a prosperous man. And yet there is just one thing left for God's promises to him to be fully fulfilled, and that is for him to be able to go back home to what we call the promised land and to settle there. And that's where we pick up the story today in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob is on his way back home, or to a place that he at least hopes has some glimmer that God has promised will become his home. And so we begin to read at verse 3. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed him, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant," Jacob, no, that's an issue. Your servant. Is this a different Jacob speaking, or is this still trickster Jacob speaking? Your servant Jacob says, "I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys and sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I'm sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him." Okay, I was pretty sure he wanted to kill me. I sent out a nice gesture to him, "My servant, your Lord." Oh, and the message back, 400 men. Okay. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Okay, we're fully into his mindset here. He's like, okay, when I finally meet my brother, who knows what chaos, what mini battle is going to take place. So I'm going to divide up all my things so that he can't get all of it. And then Jacob prayed. This is one of the longest prayers that we get in the book of Genesis. And this is, you could say, the first time that Jacob really prays. Remember, he's a guy who is learning who this God is. He doesn't have all of the revelation that we have about who God is. He has tiny glimpses, ideas, promises that he's pasting together. And on this moment, this leading up to this big moment that he's going to have with his brother, he prays to this God who is still quite mysterious to him. "Oh God of," notice, not my God, "oh my God," no, "oh God of my father," it's actually his grandfather Abraham, "and God of my father Isaac, Lord, you said to me," and he's like, "I'm going to hold you to some stuff that you said. You said, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I'm unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that you have shown your servant." So he recognizes that God has been blessing him. "I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan." Remember in week 1, 2 weeks ago, when he was on his way to Haran. He has nothing. And now he crosses back, and he has almost everything that God has promised him. "Now I have become 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau. For I'm afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." He prays to God. And then it seems the next day, he's got a plan. Because let me cover all my bases. Let me try to get God on my side, but then also let me have my own scheme in mind as well. And so what he does is he starts to create these waves of blessing that he's going to send to Esau. Waves of blessing of camels and goats and sheep, and he sends them ahead of him. And when these people with all of these gifts meet Esau, they are to give Esau the gift, say, "Your servant Jacob wants to give you this wonderful gift." In hopes that by the time he gets to Esau the next day, Esau will have been pacified. Picking up the story a few verses later. That night, Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants. By the way, 2 wives, 1 too many. That's like a whole other sermon, but I just got to throw it out there just in case. His 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. And so Jacob was left alone. He sends everything he has over the river Jabbok. And then he stays back. And he's alone once again. If you remember, there was a moment like this that we talked about 2 weeks ago when Jacob is alone and he has nothing. It's like these 2 encounters are meant to mirror each other. It's like I remember when he was alone 20 years ago, and now 20 years later, he finds himself alone again. And what comes next is a bit of a wild and concise story. And within what comes next is packed so many ideas. So let me just read it, and then I'll go back and make some observations about the story. Because in the middle of this sentence, so Jacob was left alone. And you think, tomorrow's a big day. He was left alone, and then he had to think about the big day tomorrow. And what is about to happen is that what he thought would be the defining moment in his life that would happen tomorrow is actually going to happen tonight. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. I told you, concise. The biblical writers can be so concise, and they pack so much into a sentence like this. Wrestled all night? If you don't know this story, which is a good thing to do when you're reading biblical stories, is to, even if you know them, imagine if you didn't know them. If you don't know this story, who's the man? Who's the man that has wrestled with him all night? It's Esau. It's Esau. Maybe it's Laban. Maybe he made a peace treaty with Laban. But in his mind, it's probably Esau. Esau came with 400 men, and now he's chosen in the middle of the night to jump me. You're reading the story like, so he wrestles all night with Esau. Wow. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Now, this moment, you go, wait. He could not overpower him. That'll be important later. He couldn't overpower him, but then he just touches his hip, and it wrenches his hip out of socket. Who is this that he's fighting? It doesn't seem like it's Esau anymore. I don't think Esau has this kind of power. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Again, fascinating. Couldn't overpower. One touch blows out his hip, and then goes back to, "Let me go. I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Who does Jacob come to realize he was wrestling all night long? God. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. After this encounter, just to wrap up the story, and then we'll come back to it. After this encounter that he has with God, the next day he will go out and meet his brother Esau. And to his utter surprise, and to one of the most beautiful scenes that we get in the book of Genesis so far, his brother welcomes him with open arms, and they're reconciled. And Jacob does go to the promised land, and he settles down there. And so God's promises to him are fulfilled for what would happen in his lifetime. But all of that seems more like the stuff that comes after the climactic moment. It's kind of the okay, that's what flows out of this. What really seems important is this night, this encounter with God. And I want to make some observations and have us reflect on this encounter with God as we move towards communion. Because I don't know about you, but I think we all long to encounter God. Even if you don't believe that there is a God, if there was a God, you'd want to meet him, wouldn't you? And so here we have one of the most tactile encounters with God that we've had so far if we're reading through the Bible. And what does it want to teach us? Why is this story here? Why have people recorded this story and said, like, you should read this. You should tell your children this story. This story reveals something to you about the nature and character of God and what it is like to encounter him. What are we supposed to get from this story? Well, here's a couple observations and questions. First observation, God is a wrestler? We're gonna reveal ourselves to people. We're gonna put it in a book. And early on in the book, one of the first themes we're gonna go with, wrestler. Really? A wrestler? Wait a second. How on earth would God be a wrestler? And how does he wrestle with humans? How does he wrestle with he all-powerful God? He made everything, nothing is beyond him. And he's going to wrestle with, how on earth could that, well, how would that work? How do you wrestle with those who are weaker than you? If you have any nieces or nephews, if you get to be around children, if you're a parent, they want to wrestle. And yet they don't really want to wrestle. They don't really want to be like power bombed off the bed, but they want to wrestle. They want to feel your strength, and they want to feel how strong they might be. And so how do you wrestle with the child? You have to pull back a little. You have to limit yourself. You have to be gentle. You have to be gentle. You have to be power under control. And so God comes to overwhelm Jacob and just completely crush him. No, he comes with power under control. And in one of the most shocking pieces of this story is that it seems as though that the God who comes in this limited form, in this holding back form, he loses the battle to Jacob. It says after all night wrestling with him, he cannot overcome him, and he begs Jacob to let him go. And I wonder if this isn't a tiny revelation of the God who loses, but in his defeat actually has victory. The God who in his weakness actually has strength, because while he in one way loses this battle to Jacob, he eventually wins Jacob. In losing in the wrestling match, he actually wins Jacob's heart. God is revealed as a wrestler. And so a question for our reflection, is your God a wrestler? I say your God, not the sense that like we all get to have our own individual gods, but in a sense, we all have an idea of who God is, and we want to have that be a mirror of the God that is revealed to us in the Bible. And so is your God a wrestler? Next observation. Jacob doesn't know who he's wrestling. I tried to bring that out as we walked through the story. He doesn't realize who he's wrestling until the end of the story. He doesn't know that he's wrestling God. If you would have asked Jacob, hey, Jacob, what are the problems in your life? What are the things, you're a fighter, right? What are the things that you're fighting against? He'd be like, oh, I'll tell you, I fight against my brother. I fight against my mom who's so controlling and manipulative. I fight against my dad who doesn't love me as much as my brother. I've been fighting against my uncle. I fight with my wives. I probably have fights with my kids. He could have listed all the things that he was fighting with. He's like, I am a fighter. My life has been defined by struggle. And it's like God comes to him to reveal to him that all the things that he spent his life focused on, fighting against, aren't his real problem. The problem for Jacob, the struggle that he has really been in his whole life, is not against these humans. It's against God. And so what does this have to reveal to us? Perhaps this question: who are you fighting? Who is it that you think you're fighting? You think you're fighting blank, but underneath that, at the root of it, are you actually fighting God? I struggle with this thing up here. I struggle with this idea here. Is it really that, or is it underneath that something to do with God? You don't really want to trust him. You don't really want to give him control. You don't really like his ways. And so it's actually God who you've been fighting with. I wonder if this isn't meant to reveal to us one of the fundamental experiences of being a human, is to find that all the things that you thought you were fighting against actually find their root in a dissatisfaction or an anger towards God. Who is it that you are fighting against? How about this observation? God wounds Jacob. God wounds Jacob. He touches his hip and it busts out of a socket. And as far as we can tell by the way the story's told, it seems like this is a permanent injury. Is your God a wounder? I had to look that up. That's a real word. Is your God a wounder? Later on in chapter 33, Jacob will see his brother Esau. And when they are reconciled, he will say to his brother Esau, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Which I think we all can get behind that quickly. When you experience welcome and grace and love in the face of another, that's beautiful, that's God. And yet the same expression of seeing the face of God is what Jacob uses to describe when God wounds him. When they wrestle all night and he is wounded. And so Jacob says to see the face of God, sometimes you see it through wounding. Wounding that perhaps has packed into it blessing. And sometimes you see it in welcome. Sometimes you see the face of God in all the pleasant things in life, and sometimes you see the face of God in all of the painful parts of life. Is your God a wounder? Many have said some version of this, that God gets our attention best through wounding. He would love to transform us and have it all be nice and there be no pain involved, and yet that doesn't seem to be the preferred route that we like to take. We'd prefer to wrestle until it takes a wounding. And yet for Jacob, this wounding would become his blessing. Within the wounding is his blessing, and how many people haven't experienced or heard someone else say that some of the deepest scars that they have, they wouldn't trade them in for the world. Because within that wounding was somehow God's grace, somehow his love for us. How about this observation? Jacob moves from wrestling to clinging. He's wrestling with God, and then when his hip gets placed out of socket, I'll dare to make the interpretive move that he is no longer wrestling. It is difficult to wrestle when your hip is out of socket. And so the language is that he moves from wrestling to, I will not let you go, to clinging. And as I thought about this week, I thought, you could almost paint those as two buckets, and you got to be in one or the other. You're either wrestling with God, or you've given up wrestling and now you're clinging to him. And when you cling to him through prayer, through chasing after his heart, through worship, through coming to church, to going to life group, when you're clinging to him, that can feel like a safe place, like a place like his home. But as soon as you start to relax, I think I got it, God. I think I clung to you long enough. I think I can start to release this grip a little bit. Where do we eventually find ourselves again? Oh, now I'm back to wrestling again. And it seems as though the bridge from wrestler to clinger often has, as the bridge, wounding. And so do you cling to God? Have you been clinging to God? Were there times in your life where you were clinging to him far more than you are today? And you'd recognize today that lack of clinging has actually led you into a life of restlessness and wrestling. This last observation, Jacob gets a new name. He's given the name Israel. And within that idea of being given a new name is the idea of being given a new identity. Like when God renames someone, he's giving them a new identity. And much commentaries, I read many commentaries and tried to figure out what does the name Israel mean? And there's many different ideas about this. But one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that more than just the breakdown of what does this name like break down to be, is the idea that the name is tied to this experience that Jacob has. And so whenever he would hear the name, and whenever the nation of Israel would hear their own name, they would be teleported back to this story when Jacob wrestles with God and is wounded and is blessed by God. Jacob gets a new name and a new identity. This is what happens when we encounter God. And so I ask you, if you have encountered God, have you been given a new identity? What is your identity? When you truly encounter the God of the Bible, the God who is Jesus, you're given a new identity as a son or daughter of the King? Do you live in this new identity, or do you sometimes go back to an old one? And Jacob, I think, will wrestle with this through the rest of his life. Am I the deceiver, the supplanter, the trickster, or am I this new person who God has given a new name, who has been blessed by God, who has seen the face of God? Jacob wrestles with God. And I think this story has been recorded for us because it is a journey, it is an experience that all of us will have as human beings, that we will find ourselves at one moment or another wrestling with God. And so we're going to move towards communion now. And as we move towards communion, I wanted to create a space where we can reflect. And so you're going to see at the back of the room here in Waterloo, we're going to begin to hand out the elements. And as they pass out the elements, there's the juice and the cracker are stacked together in 2 cups. So just take both cups together. And this is for anybody who would say that they're a follower of Jesus. We invite you to partake. And if you're not quite there yet, then we're so glad that you are with us in the room. And we hope that maybe you're going to have a different kind of encounter with God as we celebrate communion together. But just before we take the elements, I wanted to give you some thoughts to reflect on, because we're going to play a song before we take the elements together. And so here's some thoughts. The first would be this: Jesus is the full revelation of the glimpse of the God that we get in the story of Jacob. And some of the things that we've been learning about this God in the previous weeks of the series have been this: that this God is a God who sees us. Remember that from last week? He sees you. He sees everything that you've been through, everything that people have put you through. He's a God who sees you, he hears you, he remembers you, and he promises to be with you. We get a glimpse of that God in the story of Jacob, and then we get the fullest revelation of that God in the person of Jesus. And maybe for you this morning, you just need to sit with that truth. Okay, God, I'm in a dark place. I'm in a place where it feels like I have no home, where I have no rest. And I just need to sit in the truth that you see me here and you are with me here. And these elements in my hand remind me that you know what it's like to feel alone and to suffer. But maybe for some of us, it will be a different kind of reflection. Because when I talk about wrestling with God, there are things that come to mind that you would rather not think about because you are wrestling with God. You may not even believe in God, and yet you're in this room or you're watching online. And as you try to say, I don't even believe in any of this stuff, there is a battle going on in your mind as God tries to impress himself upon you and convince you that he is real. And I'd encourage you as we sing this next song not to shy away from that. Let God wrestle you. Let him confront you. You came in here thinking that you had a whole list of problems to deal with, and God's going to show up in this next moment and reveal to you, those aren't your problems. I'm your problem. You need to deal with me in this moment. And lastly, maybe this will be a moment for some of us to rededicate ourselves to God. To rededicate, to say, I've been doing so much wrestling, I need to do more clinging to you. And so in this moment, I resurrender, as we sang earlier. I rededicate myself to you. Let me pray, and then we're going to pass out the elements. God, come and wrestle with us in this moment. And do so in your mysterious, gentle way. Would you confront us? Would you draw us to yourself? Jesus, would you move by your Spirit?